There are images that change the way a civilization understands itself. Not the carefully composed photographs that hang in galleries, not the deliberate documentation of wars or coronations or moon landings, but the accidental ones. The ones captured by a dashboard camera left running on a car that is never meant to survive. The ones recorded by a security feed in a harbor warehouse whose operator had evacuated 20 minutes before the water arrived. The ones filmed by a man standing on a hillside who kept the camera steady because steadiness was the only thing left that he could control. March 11th, 2011, produced more of those images than any natural disaster in human history. For the first time, a mega tsunami was not reconstructed from sediment layers and survivor testimony. It was watched in real time by the world, and the world was not prepared for what it saw. At 2:46 in the afternoon, on a Friday in early spring, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake ruptured the subduction zone where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the Okhotsk Plate, approximately 45 miles east of the Oshika Peninsula on Japan's northeastern Tohoku coast. The rupture zone extended approximately 310 miles along the fault and 90 miles in width. The seafloor in some sections lurched as much as 164 feet horizontally and 33 feet vertically in the space of seconds. The energy released was equivalent to approximately 600 million times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan. It was the fourth most powerful earthquake recorded anywhere on Earth since modern seismic instrumentation began. The shaking lasted 6 minutes. In Tokyo, Ryoka 230 miles to the south, skyscrapers swayed for minutes after the initial pulse. Bullet trains were halted automatically by the nationwide seismic detection grid. In Sendai, in Miyako, in Rikuzentakata, in Ishinomaki, in hundreds of coastal towns along the Sanriku coast, people who had drilled for this their entire lives felt the earth move and understood, at a level deeper than thought, what was coming next. They had perhaps 30 minutes. But to understand what those 30 minutes meant and why they were not enough for everyone, you have to understand what Japan had built along that coast and why it had built it there, and what it believed that construction meant. The Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan is one of the most geologically predisposed tsunami hazard zones on Earth. It is a RIA coastline, a term for a landscape shaped by the drowning of river valleys, producing a deeply indented shoreline of inlets, bays, peninsulas, and narrow channels. This geography does two things simultaneously. It creates one of the most productive fisheries in the Pacific, concentrating marine life in nutrient-rich inlets. And it creates a natural amplification system for tsunami wave energy. When a tsunami wave enters a narrowing bay, the same shoaling physics that operate on any coastline are intensified by the funnel geometry of the RIA. The wave has nowhere to spread laterally. It piles. It accelerates upward. The historical record of the Sanriku coast, going back to the Meiji Sanriku tsunami of 1896 and the Showa Sanriku tsunami of 1933, was a record of repeated catastrophic inundation, of communities rebuilt in the same locations by fishing families who had no viable economic alternative to proximity to the sea. Japan's response to that history was the most ambitious coastal engineering program ever undertaken by any nation on Earth. Over decades, the government constructed a system of seawalls, breakwaters, and floodgates along the Tohoku coast that represented, in total, an investment of roughly $12 billion. The Kamaishi Bay Breakwater, completed in 2009 after 30 years of construction, was listed in the Guinness World Records as the world's deepest offshore breakwater. It sat in 207 feet of water. Its total length exceeded 2 miles. It had been engineered to withstand a tsunami generated by a magnitude 8.3 earthquake, the largest event that Regional Hazard Assessment had considered a credible planning scenario. The wall at Taro, a town that had been almost entirely destroyed in both 1896 and 1933, was 51 feet tall and surrounded the community in a concrete embrace that residents had come to regard as definitive protection. March 11, 2011, was not a magnitude 8.3 event. The waves that the magnitude 9.0 rupture generated arrived at the Sanriku coast in intervals. The first waves reaching some communities within 15 to 30 minutes of the earthquake. At Miyako, the water rose to 40.5 meters above sea level in one measured location. That is 132 feet. At Anayoshi, a hamlet so small it barely registers on regional maps, a stone marker stood on the hillside above the village. It had been placed there after the 1933 tsunami, when the inscription read, "Do not build your homes below this point." The 2011 tsunami stopped just short of that marker. Every building above it survived. Every building below it was destroyed. The marker had been correct for 78 years. In 2011, it was correct again. But most communities on the Sanriku coast did not have a marker. They had a seawall, and the seawall was not enough. The Kamaishi breakwater slowed the wave. Engineering analysis conducted after the disaster found that the breakwater reduced wave heights inside the bay by approximately 40% and delayed the arrival of peak wave energy by several minutes. Those minutes are credited with saving lives. But the wave was so far outside the design envelope that the breakwater's partial effectiveness was also a testament to its fundamental insufficiency. The water came over it, around it, and eventually damaged sections of the structure itself. The wall at Taro was overtopped. The floodgates at Fudai, which had been built to 51 feet by a mayor who had been called wasteful and who had died before he could be called prescient, held. Fudai survived nearly intact. It was the exception that proved the rule. The ignition of the disaster's most lethal phase occurred in the narrow inlets and river mouths, where tsunami energy concentrated with the most savage efficiency. In the city of Rikuzentakata, situated at the head of a bay, the wave arrived not as a wall, but as a dark, churning surge that moved inland at speeds eyewitnesses estimated at 30 to 40 miles per hour. It carried everything the coast had ever built: ships, cars, lumber yards, storage tanks of diesel fuel and propane, entire houses, structurally intact, rotating slowly in the current, like toys in a bathtub. And it was all on camera. The footage from Rikuzentakata that circulated globally in the hours and days after the disaster showed something that no prior tsunami had ever shown: the mechanism of total destruction in real time. You could watch a neighborhood exist and then watch it cease to exist, not through explosion or fire, but through the methodical, almost patient advance of black water that simply covered everything it reached and carried away everything it covered. The color of the water was not blue. It was not green. It was the color of the earth it had already consumed. A dense, turbid black brown loaded with soil and debris and fuel, and the material contents of tens of thousands of lives. Survivors watching from hillsides described the smell as overwhelming. A combination of diesel, salt water, pine, and something else that no one wanted to identify precisely. In the coastal town of Minamisanriku, the Disaster Coordination Center on the third floor of the government building was overwhelmed when the wave topped the roof. 29 of the 30 staff members inside the building died. A young woman named Miki Endo, 24 years old, had been at the public address microphone continuously from the moment the earthquake ended, broadcasting evacuation instructions over the town's emergency speaker system. She was still broadcasting when the wave took the building. Her voice was the last sound many survivors heard before they reached higher ground. She did not survive. She is remembered in Minamisanriku as the woman who kept talking. The Mayday reality of March 11th was not a single moment, but a 6-hour cascade of emergencies that overwhelmed every response system simultaneously. Japan's self-defense forces, which mobilized the largest domestic military operation in post-war Japanese history, would ultimately deploy over 100,000 personnel to the disaster zone. But in the first hours, there was no response to coordinate. The roads into the coastal communities were blocked or destroyed. The harbors were full of debris and grounded vessels. The helicopters that arrived over the coastline in the late afternoon of March 11th transmitted aerial footage that remains some of the most disorienting documentation of destruction ever recorded. Entire towns reduced to gray fields of broken timber and concrete rubble. Their street grids erased, made their geography so altered that pilots struggled to identify communities they had flown over for years. Ishinomaki, the largest city in the disaster zone, lost more than 3,000 residents. Entire neighborhoods in the city's low-lying coastal wards were swept clean. The elementary school at Okawa became the site of what would become one of the disaster's most agonizing post-event inquiries. 74 of the school's 108 students died, along with 10 of the 13 teachers on duty. The school stood several miles inland from the coast, in a river valley. The tsunami had traveled up the Kitakami River and struck the school from the landward side, the direction from which no one had considered the wave might come. The families of the children who died pursued litigation against the city for years, arguing that the teachers had delayed evacuation and moved toward the river rather than away from it. The case exposed the gap between having an evacuation plan written on paper and having the practiced, instinctive decision-making capacity to execute it under 6 minutes of ground shaking followed by the sound of a wall of water in the middle distance. The scientific autopsy of March 11th produced findings that restructured tsunami science in ways researchers are still processing. The rupture itself contained a shallow component near the trench that slipped an extraordinary distance, perhaps 160 to 200 feet. a phenomenon that amplified the tsunami far beyond what the overall magnitude would have predicted using prior scaling relationships. This near-trench slip, marsh occurring in sediments that most models had considered too weak and unconsolidated to store and release that magnitude of strain energy, meant that the existing formulas for translating earthquake magnitude into tsunami height were inadequate. The event was, in the language of seismology, a supercycle rupture, a scale of event that the instrumental record was too short to have documented before, and that the geological record had not been sufficiently interrogated to reveal. The Tohoku tsunami's deposit layers were subsequently found in coastal sediment cores extending back over 1,000 years, indicating that comparable events had occurred in this region on timescales of several centuries. The hazard had always been there. The planning horizon had simply not been extended far enough to see it. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, located on the coast 150 miles south of the epicenter, was designed to withstand a tsunami of approximately 18 feet. The wave that arrived on March 11th was over 45 feet tall at that location. At the plant's backup diesel generators, which were required to maintain cooling of the reactor cores after the earthquake severed grid power, were located in the basement. The wave flooded the basement. 3 reactors melted down over the following 3 days in the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, adding a radiological catastrophe layered onto and inseparable from the tsunami catastrophe. Evacuating 154,000 additional people from a 12-mile exclusion zone that in some areas remains restricted more than a decade later. The conversation about what the tsunami of March 11th destroyed is therefore a conversation that is still unfinished. Both the final confirmed death toll from the earthquake and tsunami reached 15,899 people, with 2,529 additional persons officially listed as missing. A bureaucratic category that carries its own specific weight in Japanese culture. The weight of bodies that the ocean took and did not return. Property damage was assessed at approximately $235 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in recorded history at the time. The earthquake shifted the Earth's axis by an estimated 6.5 inches. The coastline of Honshu moved eastward by as much as 8 feet in some locations. The disaster was so large that it was measurable at the scale of the planet itself. What the camera footage added to all of those numbers was something that numbers cannot carry. The visual grammar of what loss at this scale actually looks like, not as an abstraction or a statistic, but as a sequence of frames in which something is present and then absent, in which a fishing boat is in the harbor and then it is on the roof of a building 400 meters inland, in which a traffic intersection exists and then does not. The footage from March 11th was studied not only by engineers and seismologists, but by psychologists, urban planners, and emergency managers around the world who recognized in it a kind of diagnostic tool that no prior disaster had provided. You could see exactly what happened. You could pause the footage and study the moment at which a seawall failed, or a floodgate held, or a road became a channel. You could watch the wave think. If thinking is not too strange a word for the hydraulic logic of water finding the path of least resistance through a city. So Japan's response to March 11th has been characteristically both enormous and contested. The government committed to rebuilding the coastal communities of Tohoku with seawalls of even greater height, in some places walls of 46 feet or more, towering concrete structures that have divided the communities they are meant to protect. Many residents of the rebuilt Sanriku towns say that the new walls cut them off from the sea that has defined their culture and their livelihood for generations. Fishermen say they can no longer see the water. Children have grown up in coastal towns where the ocean is invisible. Other residents say they would accept any wall, any separation, any concrete barrier between themselves and what they watched from the hillside on March 11th. The debate is not resolvable. It is the debate of a society trying to inhabit a coast that will, with geological certainty, be struck again. The Nankai Trough, a subduction zone off Japan's Pacific coast to the southwest, is considered by seismologists to be approaching the end of its interseismic cycle. A magnitude 8 to 9 event along the Nankai Trough is not hypothetical. It is a projection. The Japanese government's own estimates for a worst-case Nankai Trough tsunami put the potential death toll at over 300,000 people and the economic damage at trillions of dollars. Now they have footage. Now every emergency manager, every coastal engineer, every school teacher in a town that sits at the head of Araie Bay has access to the most complete visual record of what a mega tsunami does to a modern, prepared, seismically sophisticated coastal civilization. Japan was not unprepared on March 11th. Japan was the most prepared nation on Earth. And the toll was 15,899 confirmed dead, 2,529 missing, 1 nuclear catastrophe, and $235 billion in destruction. The footage does not argue that preparation is futile. It argues, with the quiet, implacable authority of recorded fact, that preparation must be honest about the scale of what it is preparing for. In Rikuzen Takata, a single pine tree survived the inundation. It stood in a coastal park where 70,000 pines had grown before the wave. The tree was designated a national symbol of resilience. It died 2 years later from saltwater damage to its roots. Efforts to preserve it through elaborate artificial treatment, grafting, and reconstruction ultimately produced a preserved version of the tree that stands today in the same location. Technically the same tree and technically not. It is a complicated kind of monument. It is the kind of monument that March 11th deserves. The ocean is still there. It is warm again in the spring. The fishing boats go out before dawn from the rebuilt harbors. And the men on those boats know what the water can carry and what it can take. Because they have seen it with their own eyes, or because their fathers have, or because the footage exists and has been shown to every child in every coastal school in Tohoku as part of a curriculum that has only one ultimate lesson. The camera kept running. Now so must you.